Cecilia couldn't sleep. It was 8 in the morning now and her exhausted mind would not shut down, despite every effort she had made to relax. Thoughts raced through her mind fighting an insistent urge that she should indeed give in to slumber. That she hadn't had sleep for such a long time was not good, she knew. But Cecilia also knew the terrible feeling of hurt that she would feel when she reawoke, in the amnesiacal mist of first consciousness. If she were to get over this, she needed to concentrate fully, and without distraction on her work. She had said as much to Snape on their return journey. And she was also listening to the cowardly thoughts at the back of her mind that were telling her of the despair she would feel again, as she had done with Tim. Cecilia's mind recalled the drive back to outside the gates of Hogwarts as she lay refreshed after a bath and a change of clothes on her old bed in her old room in the teachers' quarters. With hindsight, it was probably not the best idea to attempt to drive 6 hours to Northumberland. The early morning had not been a problem. There had been no one on the roads and despite her less than perfect driving they hadn't got stopped. The effort went out of driving and her anger waned almost an hour and a half into their journey when on a lonely B road just outside Buxton, the car had run out of petrol. Emotion had drained through her as the realization that though the tank was registering half full the spluttering in the engine was telling her otherwise and she had pulled over, turning off the therapeutic music of Amy's classic 80s rock ballads which had been blaring out from the speakers. Snape had got out of the car when they had come to a halt and had let her take the lead in diagnosing and attempting to fix the problem. It had turned out to be much more than a lack of petrol that had caused them to stop. Cecilia had discovered that oil was leaking from the underside of the car near the exhaust valve and from the sound when she tried to restart the sports car it seemed to be getting worse. Defeated, Cecilia informed Snape of the fact as she leaned against the bonnet of the car. She half expected him to make a snide comment that she turned into as a compliment in her mind, but he didn't. What he did do was lean against the car next to her and look where she was looking, through the mist at the darkened landscape that was sprinkled with houses, fields and trees. Then he turned to her and politely informed her that if there was anything he could do in a non-magical way to assist her in their transit to Hogwarts then she should tell him, before magicking her a hot drink, which tasted like butterbeer, but a tang of oriental spices. "It's non-alcoholic," he'd explained, sipping at the other. "It won't harm you." Cecilia remembered the last time she had drunk butterbeer, with Snape in the Three Broomsticks in Hogsmeade. It had given her the undesired effects of magical yeast cells reclaiming their lost energy and leaching it parasitically from Cecilia, making her very tired and weak indeed. Her overtaxed mind now dwelt on the most amazing part of their return, something Cecilia would never have predicted. Cecilia had begun to pour her heart out as they stood together in the darkness next to a broken-down Alfa Romeo Spider. And as she had done so, tears dropping into her drink, Severus Snape listened to her. Not just murmured in the right places combined with silence. As the energy and fury coursed out of her he spoke words of comfort. She'd cried and he'd consoled. She raged and he remained silent. She griped and complained and he agreed. It was as if she was with Libby, reassuring and vaguely helpful, only Snape was a 6-foot wizard who wouldn't know what to do with eyelash curlers in a million years. Cecilia's hand tightened round something as she recalled what had happened next. When she had grown silent, her emotions borne to the empty landscape, Snape had reached into his pocket and dug out something, handing it to her. To Cecilia's utter amazement it was her compact, the one, she recalled, that was tipped out of her bag when she had been surprised by Draco and company, in the library, when they were menacing her about being a squib and had smashed onto the floor. She had forgotten all about it. Now, she looked back down into her hands and it was perfect. The compact was as new as the day she had taken it from the box, when Tim had given it to her, and her initials CJW on the bottom of the case and CJF on the top glinted in the candlelight of her room and mother of pearl on the glass cases. She remembered when Tim had given it to her, and the swell of emotion as Snape had done the same thing that morning. As she looked at the box now, her eyes filled with unbidden tears as she recalled it once broken and lost for good on the library floor, and illogically the story Snape had told her, of his personal life, flashed into her mind too. How much he trusted her, and must value what she could give. "And you want me back?" she questioned silently to herself. "When I was too blind with flattery and naive trust to see through Sirius Black's plan?" That had been the question she had asked Snape when she stared at the compact as they stood by her car, at 4:30 that morning, as she turned her compact over and over in her hands. "Indeed we do. Who else would I be able to trust to carry out this work? We need you more than ever. I need you, Cecilia. I could not trust anyone else with this." He had moved from foot to foot before coming closer to her and gazing in the same direction as she. "Besides, I believe some of my science work has gone awry. I need your non-judgmental eye for us to proceed and progress." And then she had allowed him to whisk them through the 200 or so miles of landscape back to Hogwarts in her broken car as it hovered a few inches from the floor before landing with an unhealthy crunch before the gates of Hogwarts and then tearing off in the direction it had come. Cecilia hadn't wanted to ask questions of Snape, such as the nature of the work now, her status, or even where the car was going. She was just so relieved to be here, at work. Somewhere she knew. What remained to do? How could she be of the most use? Quickly she pulled herself out of bed, the covers still tightly bound round her, and pulled open her desk drawer. Finding there was no parchment, Cecilia knelt beside one of her bags where she knew she had stowed some lined A4 paper and a biro, throwing aside clothes, shoes and a bottle of sodium metal, still in its soil. The bottle rolled under the bed and Cecilia scrabbled back for it, thanking her lucky stars it had not broken on the hard floor before placing it firmly on her desk. Returning to the case, she tossed aside her ominous dress that she had worn to the Yule Ball and the cape in search of the paper before her eye was drawn back to the dress. No, not the dress itself, but the brooch that was pinned to its collar. "Why?" she thought coldly, picking up the dress roughly and wresting the brooch from the fabric. "Why did you give this to me, Remus? Why?" Cecilia opened her desk drawer and threw in the brooch, making a mental note that she should return it by owl as soon as she could before looking round the room again. No paper. How could she, teacher Cecilia Frobisher, have no paper? Well, she would have to think through her work aloud, then, and try to reason it out. At the very same moment, a wizard and a witch, locked in a gaze with the headmaster of Hogwarts School, were waiting for him to continue. Reciprocator. What does reciprocator mean? Cecilia and Minerva McGonagall asked this question at precisely the same moment, however, where Cecilia was pacing round her room, wrapped in her bedclothes still. Minerva sat bolt upright on the purple settee in Dumbledore's study. Let me start at the beginning. Dumbledore looked between Minerva and Severus Snape. Cecilia Frobisher discovered information regarding a wizard whom we know, Raymond Lully. He is related to the Black family through Alpard Black, a staunch believer in the equality of moles to wizards, a belief which was once held by Joseph Black. At the name, Snape flinched and McGonagall held on to her spectacles. "Joseph Black?" asked Minerva, clearly shocked. "Equality of moles?" "Yes," said Snape quietly, glancing at her. Dumbledore waited until they were quiet again before recommencing. Lully was a member of an organization set up by his ancestor, Joseph Black, with the aim of sharing of information between moles and wizards, to build national and international relations between us. Members of the organization, reciprocators, worked alongside moles and whilst collecting information to further our understanding of the world as the march of science continued, we in turn assisted with the transit of information, manufacture of materials and progress of technology. In addition, they recruited select moles who would accept them as collaborators into their work. He paused, as if inviting questions from either professor. Coughed Minerva. They actually existed? Reciprocators? I was under the impression they were a fabrication, a mere fable to encourage solidarity between wizarding families. They were, replied Dumbledore, and what else for a fable than something rooted in truth? Their work did not go down well with many pure-blood families, of course, although many saw them as a boon. Do not forget that the Reciprocator organization was founded over 200 years ago, and attitudes were different from the distillate ones of Voldemort and his followers. Joseph Black, murmured Cecilia, stubbing her toe absently on the end of her bed. Joseph Black, continued Dumbledore to McGonagall and Snape, was himself a reciprocator and also set up the many relationships of reciprocators with select muggles. He chose them personally, allowing for the best match of ability and benefit to both Muggle and Wizard communities. His own reciprocation was with the engineer James Watt, and from Black's own original ideas Watt was able to develop the ideas of the steam engine. Such associations were considered a success in the wizard world. Long had we ignored Muggles, and they forgot us. Now, at last, it seemed that there was a way forward for us to live harmoniously. Dumbledore shifted in his armchair now, waiting for the information to sink into their minds. It was much to handle, he supposed. However, when Watt had a working steam engine, power for Muggles, he ignored Black claiming the discovery of the source of power for the Muggle world. Many of his contemporaries took up the engines, and he was of such significant influence that Joseph Black was denied the information. Furious, Black tried to force the matter through the Wizengamot, and when that failed, called to disband the Reciprocators in 1798. Such an influential wizard as Black demanding this action caused a divide across the organization, and many practicing reciprocators, who had spent many long years in collaboration with Muggles, refused to give up the practice. This became so much of a problem for the Ministry that they declared reciprocators illegal. This has two effects. Dumbledore looked between McGonagall and Snape again, both sitting like statues, in delaying technological progress in the Muggle world and promoting anything carried out by Muggles as unnatural practices to prevent more recruits. Many reciprocators still remained, and continued to work with Muggles in the field of science. However, they worked in utmost secrecy right up until the 1950s. He looked at the wizard and witch before him again, who were frozen before him like icicles, hanging on every word. They worked successfully for many years, through many Muggle scientific developments, and met secretly to plan where they would next be deployed and whom they could recruit to continue the work. In addition, they wrote the science stories into a book in order to preserve them in a format understandable to wizards. Mysterious mythology, pondered Cecilia, pacing before the fireplace now. Remus's book, breathed Minerva. That's the book they wrote, she said, looking aghast. But that's been in existence for thousands of years, a children's book of stories. It was adapted and reissued, replied Dumbledore. No one who was looking for information on the reciprocators and their discoveries would consider a child's book. And what better way to allow our world to be familiar to Muggle science than to make them available to children? Marvelous, he added, a twinkle of admiration in his eye. It was updated periodically, throughout the discoveries of the 19th and early 20th centuries, as reciprocators contributed the work of their Muggle collaborators, of those Muggle scientists that Cecilia Frobisher discovered when she returned to her world to collect the information from the hair. Contributions which were detailed and far-reaching, shining a light on wizards as well as Muggles, right up until Raymond Lully. Dumbledore rose from his chair, and extending his arm, he flicked his wand towards the shelf to the right of ex-headmaster Dippet, and a book extracted itself from between two others and steadily floated across Dumbledore's study, coming to rest, still closed, in Minerva's lap. "Open it," he said. "Tell me what you see." Minerva opened the front cover of the book and looked at the title page. Then she flicked onto the first page and the next, finally flicking through the pages quicker and quicker until she reached the back cover. "It's Remus Lupin's book," she said, looking back at Dumbledore. "It's mysterious mythology." "No." Minerva jerked her head back and looked at Snape, who had spoken the word firmly and clearly. She handed it to him. "See for yourself, Severus," she replied, dismissively. "But I thought Cecilia had the book in her possession?" Minerva looked at Dumbledore for qualification. "She does," growled Snape, opening the book to the first page. "This is not his copy." She stopped, as Dumbledore held up a hand. "Please continue, Severus. Why is this not Remus Lupin's copy?" He looked expectantly at Snape, as did McGonagall. "The border on the title page," he began, pointing at the fleur-de-lis border that surrounded it. "In Lupin's copy it reads energy light magic as Mrs. Frobisher described. Which is the exact relationship that translates energy to magic, and vice versa. The relationship that makes magic work," he added. He glanced at Dumbledore and at McGonagall, whose mouth was open in an O of surprise. "And the story of the little boy who had discovered minuscule strings hidden in small pockets inside his body that controlled how big he grew is also missing. It was the fifth story in the book." Snape flicked it over to where it would have been, if this copy of mysterious mythology had been Remus Lupin's. "Yes," nodded Dumbledore. "It is indeed not the one given to Cecilia Frobisher by Remus Lupin. It is in fact the edition that directly preceded it, updated by the last reciprocator in existence prior to Lully and sadly, not put into circulation." "But why?" asked Minerva suddenly. "If this information existed, why not make it available directly to wizards?" "Reciprocators are still technically legal," replied Dumbledore, "although their existence is taken as more of a joke by members of the Ministry, these days." "Raymond Lully," declared Cecilia, her mind wandering to what she knew of him. And being a reciprocator like Lully, in the early 20th century in the Mole world was no laughing matter. However, those that still existed were still completely dedicated to their work. However, anti-Mole prejudice began to rise in the decades preceding the Goblin riots and their existence became even more difficult. So did recruitment of further reciprocators, to assist with the exchange of information. This is when, following the highly successful recruitment of Pompops Pomfrey to deal with medical advances, Lully became desperate to recruit another, overlooking a few basic checks in the family department. "A fatal mistake," commented Snape. "Indeed," replied Dumbledore. "Which is where the Death Eater Avery comes in." Snape jerked his head quickly to Dumbledore. "Oswald T." Cecilia racked her brains to remember where she had seen the name before. Lully knew dark forces were after him and believed his life was in danger as early as 1930s. Pomfrey was excellent in his field, however he was not easily dissuaded from his specialism, so Lully decided he needed to recruit another reciprocator, to replace him or at least carry on with his work. He made an association with a wizard, Oswald T. Avery. "Oswald T. Avery," whispered McGonagall in horror. "The man who engineered the Goblin riots? Where Raymond Lully was assassinated?" "The very same." It was not Dumbledore who replied now. It was Snape. The two professors exchanged silent thoughts before looking at Dumbledore. Oswald T. Avery, a pure-blood wizard with an intolerable hatred for moles, had information passed to him accidentally at the Ministry of Magic that Pompops Pomfrey was a reciprocator from letters he had written. These are, incidentally, the notes that Poppy gave to Cecilia to study in the first few weeks of her research. Avery followed Pomfrey to St. Mungo's and was intrigued to discover he had been set to work by none other than Raymond Lully, whom Avery had suspected of reciprocator recruitment in the past. He claimed to have been sent by Pomfrey as a recruit, and Lully recruited him on the spot, setting him to work with a scientist who had just begun to study in detail human cells. Avery fed information back to Lully, but, unbeknownst to Raymond, he was an ally of Tom Riddle and an advocate of the young wizard's beliefs. Dumbledore watched a shadow pass briefly, as a cloud, over Snape's face. Over the years, Avery fed Lully information from the scientist to him, keeping him happy and waiting for his chance to shine with Riddle, though eventually, Lully became suspicious of Oswald Avery and decided that he needed to preserve the information in the next generation of Mysterious Mythology books. He contacted the son of the last publisher, a pro-mole wizard who took the book and made one preliminary copy, presenting it to Lully a month before the Goblin riots. Lully was impressed, and agreed to come back shortly in order for more copies to be commissioned containing the additions that you described, Severus, to be added to it. Remus Lupin! Exclaimed Cecilia, kicking her ball dress angrily across the floor before staring angrily at her desk drawer. Lupin's copy. So how much does he know? How did it end up in his possession? Snape sat stiffer on the settee. Remus is not aware of this information. His father was the publisher who had made just that one single copy, and when Lully did not return, began to read the stories to his son. So you are saying that, hidden amongst the fairy stories in Remus Lupin's copy of Mysterious Mythology, Raymond Lully hid the secrets of the reciprocators in amongst the fairy stories in the book. McGonagall spoke her confused thoughts aloud, trying to keep up, and Dumbledore nodded slowly. This came just in time, for only 6 months later he was killed, assassinated, in the Goblin riots. When he did not return, Remus's father was contacted by the last remaining reciprocator, who was unable to interpret the work before he too succumbed to Voldemort's wrath. John Lupin swore that he would keep the book safe and secret when he learned of his death, and began to read the stories to a very small Remus. With the ever-increasing polarity between our two communities and with the increase of scientific advance, the information was lost to us, and memories of Mole-Wizard unity just specks in the memories of older wizards. Dumbledore shook his head sadly as he walked over to Fawkes. As he got to his feet and approached the Phoenix, he tickled the bird's head and held out his wand again, flicking it towards the purple chair that he had been sitting on, making it disappear. We considered science and indeed moles without our interests. We were arrogant. We chose to believe it, and them, beneath us, and as a result we nearly lost the information forever. But how is it that you know this, Albus? John Lupin has been dead for 10 years. Minerva was on her feet now, her mind aching with the concentrated information that her mind was trying to process. Dumbledore flicked his wand, and an image of Remus Lupin, boarding the Hogwarts Express as an 11-year-old, came into focus. I recognized it the first moment I saw it. Remus Lupin's storybook that he was so reluctant to be parted with when he came to Hogwarts. His father was frantic, and told me to say it was vital the book was returned home. When I ascertained it was Lully's copy, I knew that there was help in our battle against Voldemort. But to my horror it was like another language to me. I was unable to fathom and interpret the work. But Lully was a relative of Black. Snape too was on his feet, ignoring the still-moving image of Lupin on the Hogwarts Express, being bullied by his 11-year-old self. It is indeed ironic that historically pure-blood families considered it valuable to be associated with moles, intellectually, and yet their descendants waged war against them in their ancestors' name. But Lupin, pressed Minerva. I believed the reason for John Lupin's urgency was because of... She stopped suddenly, glancing at Snape. Severus has the right to know, Minerva. I am imparting this information for the pursuit of Harry's potion, as you are both aware. Snape nodded slightly at Dumbledore. Minerva's look of urgency melted away, and she nodded too. Information made apparent to me during the trial of Avery Jr. allowed me to ascertain that it was the unique nature of this volume of Mysterious Mythology that put Remus Lupin in such danger at such an early age, something for which his father never forgave himself. Dumbledore looked. Werewolves were under Voldemort's control, and on one fateful summer evening, using the information provided by Oswald T. Avery, Fenrir Greyback entered Remus's bedroom. Unable to locate the book, he attacked Remus Lupin, causing the affliction of which we are all aware. A low growl came from the direction of Snape. He looked down, his body shaking with apparent fury. An affliction which has caused him to part company with Mrs. Frobisher, Dumbledore translated for McGonagall's benefit. Which brings me to our mole recruit. And why am I back here? Cecilia sighed dejectedly before making her way back to bed. All of those glimpses of information had turned out to be dead ends, tantalizing her with the promise of progress and at the same time leaving her frustrated and bereft of time for other work. Mrs. Cecilia Jane Frobisher. During the last war, I was unable to engage a mole to investigate the latest and most exciting lead because we were unprepared for the immensity and ferocity of the attacks from Voldemort. However, I never gave up hope that the interpretation of mysterious mythology would be the key to Voldemort's downfall, and in the years following his demise I have engaged moles, gaining glimpses into the unparalleled work of the Reciprocators, with mixed results. He looked at Minerva, who nodded in realization as pieces of past order work suddenly took on a new meaning. It soon became apparent that in order for a breakthrough to be achieved in understanding why Voldemort failed on the night he failed to destroy the 3-month-old Harry Potter, we needed someone to work alongside us, or to be precise, alongside you, Severus. Dumbledore nodded in acknowledgement of Snape's role in the work. I'll let Severus take the lead, Cecilia thought, closing her eyes. I won't get involved with these dead ends. Be professional. Concentrate on what's necessary. As she repeated her resolve like a mantra in her mind, she began to submit to the anesthesia of sleep. Minerva McGonagall nodded slowly, considering the vast amount of information that Albus Dumbledore had chosen to disclose to them both. It explained so many things. I chose Mrs. Frobisher for many reasons, not least her dedication to her work, her scientific knowledge and understanding, communication skills with teenagers and lack of ties in the mole community. Dumbledore turned and looked at both Minerva McGonagall and Severus Snape now, folding his arms and speaking slowly. Until last July, before the Goblin riots, Raymond Lully was the last reciprocator to engage a mole in collaboration. By employing Cecilia Frobisher last July to work against the evil that threatens us again, that honor is now afforded to me. 88,888,888. Cecilia used the time before the students returned to Hogwarts as an opportunity to re-engage with the priorities of her work. The days were cold, far colder than those at home, in the hospitable Midlands, and bitter. Biting winds tore through the hard granite land, rattling the iron fittings at the windows of the potions classroom and tore through the courtyard and open corridors outside. It had been almost 4 days since she had arrived back at Hogwarts after her visit home and her subsequent resumption of the potions work. Snape had indeed needed help with the work, as he'd confessed. Not only had he misinterpreted some of the electromagnetic spectrum, which was the cause of the spells registering at a far higher frequency, he had also made an assumption about the mitotic reproduction of cells and the calculation for the quantity of DNA in 8 species of animals, which had been out by 3 orders of magnitude. Sitting in the potions dungeon, Cecilia reflected on Snape's unassuming nature towards her following his request for her to return. It was as if their professional relationship remained intact, and returned to how it had been before her return home. She flipped over another page of her last notebook, the one containing information and thoughts she had written almost a month ago, before she had made the universal connection. How archaic her thoughts appeared now, on the page before her. How prosaic some of the paths she had taken, well trodden by others before her, and then inspirational when she finally had all the pieces in place. As the sound of liquid coming to the boil penetrated her thoughts, Cecilia jumped off one of the desks and retrieved the cauldron of steaming water that she needed to use for an experiment, burning her hands as the searing heat from the metal handle penetrated the double-wrapped tea towel that served as a glove. Cecilia didn't care though. Here she was, back where she needed to be, back where it was right for her. No more of wasting her time on that reciprocator and Raymond Lully business now, and Cecilia had been much relieved when Snape had agreed wholeheartedly that the main priority now was to get Harry's potion correct, as it reinforced her own decision. The plan was simple. Using the right ingredients which complemented Harry's genetic energy frequency, he could attack and disarm Voldemort and allow the Aurors to capture him. Well, that was the idea anyway, what she and Snape were using as a working theory to build upon their hypothesis. He had been far more attentive than before Christmas, which, Cecilia supposed, had been in part to do with the need to produce the potions for Harry now. The other part Cecilia didn't wish to contemplate, not since her trust had been shattered by Remus Lupin earlier that week, and even earlier by Sirius Black. No regrets, she told herself firmly as she poured some of the hot water carefully into 3 ceramic pots, even if you do still feel. No regrets. Well, 1. Not getting hold of the DNA sample of Lily Potter that Remus had promised. That would have cut down the research time probably to a few days, whereas the only process she and Snape could carry out was to systematically go through all of the potion ingredients and classify them according to toxicity, stability, energy, frequency and efficacy. The right ingredients were sure to be found, she told herself, but the real work would come to determine which they were exactly. She leaned over and added the crushed roots of the arachnid skin to the first pot, shortly followed by asphodel root to the second and to the third great auk feathers. Sighing, Cecilia considered that by analyzing every ingredient in the potions storeroom for these 4 properties, their work would probably take nearly 3 months. The pots bubbled and crackled as she stirred them, before taking a sample of each over to the microscope that she had reassembled in the potions laboratory. It would have to be moved, of course, when the students returned on Saturday. On the bright side, Cecilia mused as she angled the light from the microscope onto the sample, she might have got as far as the B shelf by then. Any good psychologist would describe Cecilia Frobisher's actions as being avoidance tactics which were being carried out in her precise and detailed manner in order to prevent her mind from succumbing to sadness and depression. Any good psychologist would encourage her to carry on with this, for it would do her good and allow her to deal with it. Any good psychologist would also be phoning the nearest mental hospital for a hasty referral if Cecilia Frobisher were to divulge that she had spent the last 6 months of her life working scientifically in a world full of wizards and magic, adding in red pen at the bottom, long-term and indefinite duration. For who could say whether continuing the work would be helpful to her, in the end? Who could say that perhaps she shouldn't have stayed at home and forgotten about all of this, crying on her best friend's shoulder, then picking herself back up and applying for a desk job? But it felt right to Cecilia, as right as the moment she had stepped through the door of 12 Grimmauld Place on the 15th of July. Amongst all the madness there had a flicker of reality which she had proven scientifically. This wasn't just a game, something she could step away from. Which is the reason that she was still there, working within the madness, and ignoring the pain. At least, that was what the main part of her mind was telling her. Another part, the stubborn part, was stamping its feet, telling the world that it was her discovery and she wasn't about to let some ignorant wizard take it and use it before discarding it once it had served its purpose. Which, whatever Snape said, and Dumbledore come to that, was likely to happen because the link went against most teachings, beliefs and attitudes of wizards, Sirius Black personifying this. Light bounced onto the asphodel root solution, allowing only the shorter wavelengths to be absorbed. Cecilia carefully peered through the lens before noting the range in her notebook, her new notebook, following the pages on which she had rewritten everything she could remember about the universal link, the steps they had taken and the evidence they had found to get there. Cecilia couldn't blame Sirius. Hate him, yes. But he had been acting on his feelings, standing up in a weird way for what he believed to be right for his godson, whatever those closest to him thought, and in whatever means were most effective, however cruel. It was for wizards like Sirius that she was doing this for, because there was a chance they could be saved and be shown the error of their ways. Spilling a bit of the arachnid skin solution, she did the same for that sample too, this time having to reposition the mirror that was reflecting the light at too sharp an angle, and finally for the orc feather. Now for the tricky bit, energy intensity. Her few days back at Hogwarts had been exceedingly quiet compared to the days back in the Muggle world. She might even have preferred to stay at home, using the internet, books and possibly another trip to see Nick at her old work, even if Remus had left. It may have speeded up the process too. But Snape had been insistent, and so very humble, thought Cecilia, so it was probably for the best. Remus. As Cecilia reboiled the cauldron over the embers of the fire, poking the ashes and adding a few more logs, she allowed her mind to consider Remus Lupin, and feelings of shame and humiliation caused her to grow pale. How could she get it so wrong? How cheap and used had it made her feel? Especially after she had let him come with her back to her home, let him kiss her, let him sleep with her. There was a word for a woman like her, a not very nice word. She had known him for as long as she had known any of the wizards, and while it was in Sirius's nature to be spiteful and cruel, it was out of character for the Remus she had previously known. Surely there was something else he could have done if he didn't want to be with her again, rather than leaving her that poor excuse for a note. But then, feeling sorry for herself as if she were the only person to be dumped in the world wasn't going to do her any good either. Despite trying to block out such thoughts the last few nights alone in bed, Cecilia's undefended mind had sprung on her the job of analyzing Remus's actions coldly, objectively and unemotionally. But no matter which way she put it, there was no justification she could think of as to why he would knowingly cause her so much harm. He must agree with his friend, and have gone back to his girlfriend, or whatever Tonks had been to him. He must have changed his mind, having been backed into a corner. Whatever the situation was, a raw stinging pain was not far from her emotions, and Cecilia had decided that the best way to deal with it was to forget these people and their lives, so apart from her own world that they were, and get on with the work she had agreed to do. She had been through this before. The last time Sirius Black tried to kill her, and this time Cecilia was determined to learn from her mistake. Agreed with Snape to do, she corrected herself as she swilled out the ceramic bowls. She had yet to speak directly to Dumbledore, and considering it was 6 days until the students returned to Hogwarts, she had no idea as to what she would be doing, even whether he still required her to continue with her old cover as the Muggle Studies teacher. Continuing for the next 3 ingredients in the quiet of the potions laboratory, Cecilia was startled to hear strange noises coming from outside the classroom. Tentatively and prepared, ethanoic acid was a good weapon against mischievous peeves, for it caused temporary immobility. She opened the wooden oak door. A dark green-grey blur outlined in red and yellow dashed past her, holding what looked like a silver tray. Lady did not come for dinner in the Great Hall. The blur that had whisked past her turned out to be Dobby, who thrust the tray and its contents, a steaming bowl of stew and 2 slices of hand-cut bread, into Cecilia's hands. "Thank you, Dobby," said Cecilia, almost dropping the tray as she balanced it in her hands with the bottle of poltergeist deterrent and putting it down on the nearest table. "And how are you?" "Better now Dobby knows Lady is safe." "Now Dobby knows Lady is not." He stopped, whimpering and holding on to his bobble hat, wringing it forcefully. "Dead." Cecilia looked kindly at the house elf, who had sought her out the day she had returned to Hogwarts and had been a non-stop feature in the potions classroom, as well as the Great Hall at mealtimes and her room in the mornings. "No," said Cecilia patiently. "I'm not dead. And it's thanks to you, Dobby. You warned me about what a blood deed was." She smiled, and Dobby hopped up and down from one foot to another, looking frantic. Winky wondered whether Lady would like to come to the kitchen to celebrate. Dobby gestured to the purple party hat and rainbow-striped horn that lay next to the food. Cecilia frowned. Celebrate? What? The New Year, squeaked Dobby. It is the one time permitted to all house elves for celebration. It is a time that all elves can be united. Cecilia nodded, looking hungrily at the food as the clock in the high school tower informed them that it was 11 o'clock. Why, of course, said Cecilia, sitting down at the desk. That would be a pleasure, Dobby. Let me eat this lovely supper you've made me and put away these things, then I'll be down. Spooning up some of the soup and reorienting her mind to the impending new year, she watched as Dobby turned a dance on the spot before looking at her experiments. Before Cecilia could get to her feet or shout at Dobby to leave her things, he'd clicked his fingers and her equipment cleaned and tidied itself away. Damn, thought Cecilia, smiling gratefully at Dobby, who turned with a look of pleasure on his face. The last time the house elf had been helpful, her wavelength readings had increased by several hundred nanometers, suggesting that the natural frequency of energy in the potion ingredients had been disrupted by the spell he had performed. Thank you, said Cecilia, gratefully. Let me finish this, and I'll be down to the kitchen, okay? Yes, he replied, hopping and skipping towards the door. Anything lady says. Winky and Bingo will be excited. He added, opening it and bounding into the corridor. Putting down her spoon and getting to her feet, Cecilia walked over to her equipment and sighed. The cauldron was spotless, sparkling like a new pin. The microscope was packed away with its cover on, the cover slides put away neatly and tidily in the box, and the ingredients from the potion store cupboard back in the jars. Oh well, thought Cecilia as she glanced back at her supper. She hadn't had any food since breakfast, and now the beautiful aroma of the stew invaded her nostrils, beguiling her to sit and eat. Perhaps should forget about the work for tonight and see the elves. Apart from Dobby, she had not seen any other elves in the castle, and besides, it would help her focus. Cecilia closed the potions classroom door behind her and began to make her way towards the main part of the castle. There was so much work that needed to be done, she thought, as the cold December wind bit at her cheeks. I only hope that we are on the right lines. She walked through the courtyard of Hogwarts and in through the huge imposing doors that opened on their own as she approached them. Dumbledore had not spoken to her since Christmas Day, in her gas fire at home, but she had decided that if he wanted her to do anything other than the science work of the potion, he would have contacted her. Muffled noise could be heard now as Cecilia approached the top of the first flight of stairs. To her right led the stairs to the kitchens, and as she approached, the sounds of merriment permeated the silent corridors. But there were a few things that still perturbed her, however. Snape had been in agreement about Lily's DNA sample that afternoon in theory, but had made it clear the potion was their main priority. And while Cecilia had already rationalized to herself that this was indeed the best way to get their results they needed in the shortest time possible, it was always slightly disconcerting when Snape was so definite about a course of action. His position, once declared, always seemed so immovable that Cecilia's instinct was to challenge it, and following their conversation she had spent most of the rest of the day wondering idly whether his inaction was because Snape had been in love with Lily too. Cecilia descended the stairs to where the house elves were clearly enjoying their party, stepping slowly in the half-light, their high squeaky voices chirruping to one another. And another thing, was she to continue with her teaching? The students were to return on Saturday, Cecilia knew. There were barely any teachers at school, Snape of course, Professor Flitwick who was keeping himself to himself, and Binns. She had not even seen Hagrid, who was usually milling around outside the castle walls and whom she used to see from time to time from the potions classroom window. Was she expected to keep her cover now, as she had done for the autumn term, carrying on the research with Snape? Cecilia shelved the thoughts at the back of her mind and took the last step into the low-ceilinged kitchen, trying not to bang her head, and was immediately inundated with elves. Surrendering to their attentions, Cecilia smiled warmly and joined their party. 88,888,888. The following morning, and Cecilia wondered whether she should have continued with her research rather than attend the party, for she felt so lacking in energy it was as if she had drunk a dozen alcohol-laden butterbeers the night before. The party itself had been very interesting. The elves had sung strange songs which they all knew by heart, and danced around empty kitchen as the furniture had been moved away. At midnight, they had formed a circle, with one elf in the center, who sang a song about wishing for more elves to be freed from the servitude of wizards that year, and Cecilia had asked Dobby why, for she had seen many an elf ignore the clothes Hermione had spent a lot of her time knitting the previous term. "We wish it, for it is tradition," Dobby had replied simply, his face falling to solemnity. Stumbling out of bed and over the contents of her bags, Cecilia made her way to the bathroom, and her heart sank as she realized that Dobby had not been there that morning. The bath was devoid of water, for the taps only dispensed water by magic, which meant Cecilia would have to wash over the sink, not the most pleasant of ablution techniques. "You look dreadful," her reflection told her as Cecilia gazed into the mirror. "A good night's sleep does wonders for the complexion." "Does it?" muttered Cecilia dolefully, considering the mess on the other side of the door. "And you would know, you stop out you." An hour later, and Cecilia had cleansed her room of anything that was unnecessary for the pursuit of the potion research. Ruthlessly she sorted out every item into 3 piles, one to use, one to keep, and one to throw out. First on the out pile went her Imanus dress and robe, which she had scooped up on the night of her return, as did some of her earlier notebooks of random musings about wizards, mere junk now. From her drawer came various letters. One Sirius had sent her about a flu liaison, and another from Tunks, the get-well-soon card from the children when she was recuperating at Grimmauld Place, her letter of employment that she had received in the post. Looking at it now, it seemed obvious to her it had been posted by someone with no idea of how the Mole postal system worked, and the comic that the Weasley twins had given to her on her birthday. In addition were several items that she had brought from home, a small photo album of her and Tim and her years-old degree-level notes. The keep, use pile contained her notebooks and DNA traces from her visit to Nick, the sodium metal that she would need to react with the silver nitrate to resolve the microscope mirror in due course, and other small bottles of chemical reagents, some real money as well as wizard gold, sensible clothing, and her original black dress robe. Cecilia looked at the to-ditch pile as she opened the last drawer of her desk, wondering what was missing, before scrutinizing the contents of the drawer and trying to fight the shiver that crept over her with cynicism as she involuntarily recalled the time just over a week ago when the dress had been thrown without care onto her own bedroom floor by a Priapus Remus Lupin. Mysterious mythology, that was what was missing. It usually resided in the bottom right-hand drawer of her desk, its beautiful green cover twinkling like an emerald when she'd opened it. Freya had it now, and she never needed to worry about having to give it back again. Within the drawer were a few pieces of parchment and A4-lined paper, as well as some quills and biros that Cecilia had remembered to bring with her. As she pulled the drawer open, further small sparks reflected off the wood, and Cecilia realized it was stuck, so she pushed her hand towards the back. Her hand met with something papery which Cecilia pulled sharply and with some effort. This released the drawer with a crunch. She looked at the contents of her hand before opening the Slytherin notebook that Snape had given to her all those months ago in order to contact him. As she went to throw it into the begone pile, Cecilia stopped, opening the book up again, and she recalled the time she had written the one and only communication to Snape using it, telling him about her genetics hypothesis, with the words disappearing shortly after writing them. And she was glad she had used it, Cecilia contemplated scornfully, or else Snape would not have returned to Grimmauld Place to discuss their early work, and Sirius Black would have succeeded in killing her with the Veritaserum. All done, she thought with a smile a few minutes later, gathering up the soon-to-be burned on a big fire in the potions classroom pile and shoving it onto a cardboard box. Then she went over to the fireplace and remaneuvered the room's wardrobe so it blocked it completely. There was no way that anyone would be contacting her in that fireplace again. Cecilia tidied up the rest of her belongings, opening her desk drawers again and stowing them away when her eye caught something she had missed in her purge. A circular brooch beset with many different colored stones. Placing it on the desk and with a shaking hand, she pulled out a parchment and quill. Writing quickly, she scribbled a message upon it, before wrapping another piece of parchment around the brooch and tying them both together with string. Cecilia picked up the quill again and held it above the smooth side of the package. Mr. R.J. Lupin, she wrote, trying to keep her hand steady, 12 Grimmauld Place, London. Then she threw the quill into the open drawer like a dart and pocketed the package in her jeans. 88,888,888. A walk to the owlery was just what Cecilia needed on the first day of the new year when she felt so rough. It wasn't as if she had knowingly consumed anything that would have affected her, so stress was the most likely explanation. It was late morning now and the dew-drenched grass reflected the sunlight as the wind rippled the blades over the surface of the landscape, causing the environment to appear peaceful and undisturbed. A good clear out. That was how her mother would describe what Cecilia had just done, something to lift the spirits, and for the first time in ages she was inclined to agree with Jane Wells. Cecilia made her way carefully up the owlery steps, taking care on the ice that still remained in the shadows, and held on to the stone rail that was designed to prevent her from falling if she were to lose her footing. And she was glad she did, for, as she rounded the entrance at the top of the tower, she ran slap bang into Dash. Hagrid. Bouncing off his middle, Cecilia landed awkwardly between the top and second step, the parcel in her hand skimming across the owlery floor. Ow! She gasped, picking herself up slowly. Quickly. Hagrid pulled her up by her waist and planting her down firmly on her feet. Mrs. Frobisher. Cecilia. I didn't see you there. Hagrid, his warm friendly face lined with concern now as Cecilia winced, trying to smile. Hagrid. She gasped, forcing the smile further before feeling the corners of her mouth droop. Are you all right? The giant wizard spoke with concern, and Cecilia looked down, as if for her dropped package. I think it went over there, Hagrid continued, striding towards the back of the top owlery step. Yeah, here ye are. Oh, he said in a tone of surprise. Remus Lupin, eh? Excuse me, said Cecilia, taking the package from Hagrid's outstretched hand. Thank you. She sniffed, feeling a flood of tears being dammed behind her eyes, held by ever-waning willpower. She went to take a step inside the owlery before feeling Hagrid's hand on her shoulder. At the touch, Cecilia could not hold them any longer, and she stood in the doorway of the owlery, crying like a 5-year-old. There, comforted Hagrid, pulling her to his leg and stroking the top of her head vaguely. You must be very upset. I know, he soothed. And I think he's the worst bugger in the world for Dash. No, sniffed Cecilia. It's neither of them. She stepped back from Hagrid, releasing his questionably clean trousers. Hagrid looked at her with an expression to match his quietening voice. I just don't know if I'm strong enough to carry on, Hagrid. I'm doing what I think, but Dumbledore hasn't mentioned anything to me. I don't know if what I'm doing is right. Well, if you don't, I don't know who does, chuckled Hagrid kindly. I mean, you sat with me and solved that puzzle right enough, about how wizards and muggles are related with genetics. And it made sense to me, and that's saying summit. And there's never been a muggle at Hogwarts before, that's how much Dumbledore trusts ye. Cecilia looked up at the giant. Whenever she had come in contact with him, she had either cried, spoke down to, or angrily at him. Cecilia knew he was a member of the Order, though not always present at the meetings, yet her reaction to him was always extreme. Why couldn't she speak to him like other wizards?